Back in 1914, the whistle was blown as a signal to attack enemy lines during the Great War, and could be the last thing a soldier heard. Back home, the very same whistle was usually blown to herald the start of a football or rugby match. Those two games were asked to provide thousands of fit young volunteers to help win the war. So what did our two biggest sports do, and what effect did it have on the war and people's lives? I was capped over 50 times for my country and an officer in the Royal Artillery. So this is a story that's close to my heart and that 100 years later I feel needs to be told. It's the story of a world at war, involving sportsmen from both codes of football, men who were employed in the world of professional soccer and those that played rugby as amateurs just for the love of it.
Estimates that about 30% of rugby players were killed in the war. So rugby took some really heavy hits.
Football's battalion played an important part in halting the German counterattacks. One of its officers was awarded the Victoria Cross.
Really, the way the two games were defined during the war became the way that they were defined for the rest of the 20th century.
Two London clubs played a significant role in what went on both back at home and on the battlefields. Over in East London, Leyton Orient Football Club were at the time called Clapton Orient. Rosslyn Park Rugby Club is in South West London, and 100 years on they are finally unveiling a memorial to their fallen. As part of the commemorations, I've been asked to get the boots out again to play in a special memorial match exactly as it would have been played in 1914. It was August of that year that we declared war on Germany, and the government asked for volunteers to go and fight for king and country. The playing of rugby matches immediately stopped, and Rosslyn Park's players stepped forward with vigour.
Rugby as an amateur sport was very quick to volunteer. 90% of the guys in the Rosslyn Park study that I've done volunteered in August or September, so the first 2 months of the war. A lot of guys coming out of public school, they'd been in the officer training corps at school, and it was a natural thing for them to go on to a regular army or navy career. And indeed, we're not far from Sandhurst, so we had quite a lot of Sandhurst officer cadets playing at Rosslyn Park. And a lot of the guys in rugby also joined territorial regiments, so they were, what was even then called weekend soldiers, and playing rugby when they could. The regular British Army was very small, and the best place to get officers from quickly, with the minimum amount of training, was those boys who'd been involved in the officer training corps at school, because they were halfway there in their training.
The reason so many rugby players signed up was it goes back to the public school ethos. They understood that they were privileged, but they also understood that with privilege came responsibility. So they knew that when the country was in peril, they had to sign up, they had to do their bit, and that often meant leading from the front, getting up in the line of fire to lead their men into battle.
In Britain before 1914, there had been a growing tide of nationalist and almost militarist sentiment in boys' stories, and the idea of the noble warrior, or the happy warrior, in Shakespeare's phrase, was very strong. And you can see that in some of the schoolboy stories that there's this idea that to die in the service of one's country was the greatest honour one could have. And of course the famous poem of that period, Henry Newbolt's Vitae Lampada, has the famous phrase, play up and play the game, both in sport and in war.
It's a normal Saturday afternoon at Leyton Orient Football Club. 100 years ago they were still called Clapton Orient, but much was the same as now. Crowds gathered, excitement built. Fans like these all over the country were still flocking to stadiums with crowds even bigger than today, because during the early part of the gruelling war, association football did not cover itself in much glory. On the 22nd of August 1914, the day before British troops fought their first major battle around the Belgian town of Mons, Professional football matches went ahead and continued for an entire season.
Football didn't pack up when war was declared, largely because the season had already started. And football, even in those days, was a highly commercialised entertainment. So bills had to be paid, players had to be paid, rents had to be paid. And so it was very difficult for them to simply say stop. In rugby union, it was relatively straightforward. Most clubs didn't pay for their grounds, they certainly didn't have professional players. The other reason why football continued was because there was a very strong argument. We're in the middle of a war, and what's necessary is to maintain morale.
Football carries on because essentially it is a professional game. There are players under contract. The prevailing mantra of the day is very much business as usual. People expect the war to be over by Christmas. Not everybody, but a sizable majority. And basically people just hedging their bets.
Players who played football in general had a working class background. They probably had jobs, they already had families. That meant that they couldn't join up in the same way that the predominantly single, young and very enthusiastic young men in rugby union could.
So enthusiastic were those rugby players to be volunteers that the government used them as poster boys in a recruitment drive.
And indeed, in November, there was actually a recruitment poster issued by the War Office saying sort of, 90% of rugby players have enlisted. Rugby union players, and they were very specific about union, are doing their duty. And it said, British athletes, will you follow their glorious example? And it actually had a statistic that said the whole of the England team from the previous season had all joined the colours. And indeed, during the course of the war, 26 England players would be killed and the 27th died of his wounds after the end of the war.
Early on in the war, casualties were higher than expected, so more and more men were needed to fight. So football matches with their huge crowds were targeted in particular to try and get volunteers from the paying spectators.
In late 1914, there was an attempt to use football matches to recruit spectators to enlist actually at matches. And before matches, there would be a speech by a recruiting officer, and then the people would be expected to enlist at half-time. This wasn't very successful. There was a recruitment rally at Arsenal, and only one person signed up.
Nothing seemed untoward. In fact, it was seen as a good way for people to go and relax and watch a game of football at the weekend, with all the bad news that started to come through. But all of a sudden, you started getting in the newspapers the casualty lists, and public opinion changed.
Following an announcement the FA was going to proceed with plans for the FA Cup that season, there were very angry letters in there in various newspapers criticising professional footballers for not coming forward and criticising the game for not ceasing the game immediately. There was a famous cartoon produced in Punch magazine which was indicative of the criticism towards the game, the fact there was no honour to be won on the football field, but there was another place they could win honour.
It shouldn't be forgotten that at the time the class system was at its peak. Rugby was played and watched largely by the ruling classes. Football, on the other hand, was already the people's game and had started to come in for serious criticism because the players were not only still at home, but still playing football for money.
These are footballers at the time on tiny, tiny wages, literally trying to earn enough to keep the family alive. And bear in mind, everybody was saying at the time the war will be over by Christmas.
Exactly.
There was no reason to give up your job because it'd all be sorted by Christmas. So people genuinely thought, well, I'll carry on because there's plenty of guys in the army who'll sort that little problem over with the Kaiser, and then we'll all everything will be back to normal in 1915. Of course, it didn't work out that way.
As the criticism stirred up by the media grew, football crowds did start to dwindle. Rugby players, though, were being feted as heroes. Bravery, gallantry, heroics. These were all words being associated with Rosslyn Park players at the time. But that came at a cost. It meant that the families of Rosslyn Park's players were receiving devastating news all too frequently.
They were the first to join up, and they became the junior officers, the lieutenants and captains. And we know from history that the death rate amongst junior officers was the highest for any branch of the army. At its worst, the life expectancy of a junior officer in the trenches was something like 6 weeks. And so the young men who had been brought up in that way and who played rugby because that was the social class they came from, signed up in their droves and were killed in their droves.
Arthur Leyland Harrison.
Morris Cazalet Harrison.
Whilst trying to uncover all the names for their memorial, present-day Rosslyn Park club members were staggered to find out just how many of their men were actually killed.
The club has the membership rolls from its very earliest days, from 1879. So working from about 1900 to about 1914, the outbreak of the war, I took every member, it was about 700, and I cross-referenced them with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database. And that was really the start of it, because we found, or I found, quite a lot just in that sweep. The final figure that we arrived at was 108, which for a club that had a standing membership of about 300 at the outbreak of World War I is a huge number. So a third of the membership were killed.
I'm not shocked by anything in the Great War anymore, but the thing that did stun me, and it's a very interesting reflection on how people dealt with the tragedy of the war and the losses, is that all the talk at the time was about numbers and about decorations. You know, the numbers of men who died and all the, you know, the VCs and the DSOs and the military cross they won. The men themselves hardly get a mention, and it's almost as if people couldn't deal with the pain of these men who lived and loved and played rugby. They couldn't deal with that personalisation of it. So they reduced everything to numbers and decorations.
Stephen Cooper actually has brought the statistics to life. He's written an award-winning book about some of the Rosslyn Park players who died. One such man was based here at the Queen's Perfumers in Jermyn Street. His role in the family business, though, meant that his journey to the trenches wasn't his first trip across the Channel.
France was very much the capital of perfumery, and it's where lots of the ingredients are actually sourced from. So he was often over there to source various rose oils and other ingredients used for the perfumery back home here.
What fascinates me is for a man to work in a perfumery. He clearly had a sort of really sensitive nose to then be in an environment with all the smells of industrial warfare and the death and the injuries and the blood and the explosives.
It's two opposite ends of the spectrum. You know, 1 minute you're smelling roses and the next, you know, you're in all sorts of horrific conditions.
You get the sense that not much has changed here since 1914. Florist is still a family-run business, and Edward Bodenham does a similar job today to that of his great-uncle Jack, and has kept his memory alive by holding on to many photographs and letters sent from the battlefields, in which most of Jack's concern was how life was back at home.
He grew up with 3 other brothers, and the family was a rather large one. There were 16 children altogether, and brought up at a house called Ivy Lodge, which they refer to a lot in letters as dear old Ivy Lodge, in sort of near Acton and Chiswick sort of area. And it's no longer there, unfortunately. So there's a great photograph of Jack actually playing tennis as well, a cigarette hanging out of his mouth.
Oh, typical gentleman.
Looks very cool.
You've got pictures here of him playing tennis in the family garden and a lovely, big, happy family of 16 of them, and then all of a sudden they're put onto the front line in the First World War, most gruelling, brutal war, arguably ever, and it must have been a hell of a sort of culture shock for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's probably reflected in the amount of letters as well that he sent. We've got a huge bundle of letters back home, just really caring about how his family are doing, what they're up to. There's an example here where he's writing to his father, and there's a sentence where he says, "I hope you're keeping well. We'll make the most of the grand weather to take a holiday in some quiet spot out of the range of the war zone. Why not a week or so in Devonshire?" We have one here where he actually asks his mother if she can pay the subscription fee to the rugby club. He makes a point of saying, "I promise I'll pay you back when I get back."
I find it fascinating that the rugby club is still charging subscription fees to guys who are out in the front line.
I posted my watch to Mr. Paul the other day and asked him to have a new glass put in it. I suggested him taking it to 89 when it's ready. Perhaps you would be so good as to settle the bill and enclose the watch when anybody is sending a parcel along. There's no hurry. Glad to hear the new gardener is a success and the garden is looking so well under his care. It must be perfect just now. This is the last letter he wrote. He actually died two days later.
Jack Bodenham was one who simply disappeared. Like so many in the Great War, his body was never recovered. But earlier this year, a group of club members took an emotional trip to the battlefields to pay their respects to one ex-Rosslyn Park player who has the rather unique honour of having two graves.
The Belgian trip was a particularly emotional one because we followed the path of a guy called Alexander Finletter Todd, who'd been a British Lion, and then he got 2 caps for England. But then he, at the age of 40, when war broke out, joined up again. He was what they call a dugout. He was dug out of retirement to serve again because he had military experience. He went off to the Western Front, and he was at a place called Hill 60, which is a grim old place which was fought over for the whole course of the war, right up until 1918. Where we're standing right now is within 50 feet or 50 yards at least of where Captain Alexander Todd was shot through the neck on April the 18th. He was on leave at home with his family and came back from leave on the 17th of April. On that very same day, the British blew the top off that hill over there, Hill 60, with mines. It's one of the first examples of mine warfare in the First World War. They blew the top off the hill, killing the Germans who were in the trenches on that hill at the time. Many of the bodies, of course, were vaporised. In the series of counterattacks and attacks that went on for the next 3 or 4 days, the very next day, so the day after getting back off leave from seeing his family, Alec Todd was shot through the throat. He was then taken further back to a casualty clearing station in Popperinga, where sadly he died, and he was buried in the cemetery, where we laid a wreath at his grave in this very quiet little cemetery in a back street in Popperinga, and very emotional. By a bit of an oddity, and this is down to the confusion of war, he's also on the Menin Gate, which is to those with no known grave. And I guess you'd put this down to a clerical error. The fact he's got a grave and he's on the Menin Gate, but in my mind, better to remember them twice than to forget them completely. And they do a wonderful thing, the firemen of Ypres. Every night at 8 o'clock, they sound the last post, and there's a very moving ceremony.
On this Menin Gate monument, we have 54,896 soldiers. So they decided to start a ceremony every day to remember all those fallen soldiers. I started 13 years ago, so normally we play week on, week off, so it must already have been a few thousand times. But I'm one of the youngest in service because of our chief bugler. In May of this year, he will be doing this during 60 years. After the First World War, the whole city was demolished. They had to start again because of all those soldiers who gave their life for our freedom. We could start again.
With news of more and more casualties on the battlefields, professional football came under even more pressure.
Casualty figures in the newspapers was a big thing. You started getting games where the supporters and those attending the game started to actually shout across to the players on the pitch during the match, why aren't you in France? What are you doing to support the country at this time of great need? And started booing and hissing.
It became apparent that various sections of the government did feel professional football was not pulling its weight. The wording was in a private letter that had no objection to occasional recreation, but did not feel that professional football fell into that category. The FA introduced a load of special recruiting measures on the 21st November 1914. The response was, how we put it, fairly disappointing, and questions were asked in Parliament about it. Thereafter, it was felt that something had to be done to take account of public opinion.
Literally 5 days after Captain Todd's death, in August 1915, professional football had played its last competitive game.
This is one of the last English League games to be played. It's Clapton Orient playing Leicester, and it's significant because Clapton's players had played a major part in changing football's role in the war. Their march past at the end in uniform gives the clue as to the outcome of a big decision taken 8 months earlier at a huge and vociferous meeting at Fulham Town Hall.
Up there, in a sadly now derelict meeting room, Clapton Orient captain Spider Parker decided to walk up upon a small stage in a rather grand room, followed by 2 other players. It turned out to be an act of great significance.
In Scotland, 11 players from Heart of Midlothian Football Club had already become part of a footballers' battalion. But in England, Clapton's players were the first to sign up.
Spider goes up onto the stage, signs on the dotted line, and behind him is the Orient goalkeeper, Jimmy Hugill, followed by Richard McFadden, and then 7 of their teammates. So 10 Orient players sign up at this meeting.
In the footballers' battalion, you had professional footballers, you had amateur footballers, you had football fans, you had staff from clubs. You had the assistant trainer at Arsenal, for example, was a member of the footballers' battalion. You had referees and linesmen, and someone had the bright idea of thinking that the referees and linesmen would make ideal NCOs because the footballers were used to taking their instructions on the field of play, and why should the field of battle be any different? The battalion proceeded overseas in November 1915 and went over to France. The strength of the battalion was roughly 1,000 men. They undertook their first real offensive action in June 1916 at the northern end of Vimy Ridge, before moving down to the Somme in mid-July, where they fought in 3 actions and sustained heavy casualties.
3 of Clapton's players, Richard McFadden, George Scott and William Jonas, were killed fighting for the footballers' battalion. In today's supporters' club bar, I met Mary Jaggs, the niece of Richard McFadden. She had had her life shaped by her father following in that player's footsteps all those years ago.
My father brought us down from Glasgow when I was 11 with my brother and sister, and when we came down we lived in Leighton Park Road, which is just across the way, and he took us to the Orient, which he used to bung us over the wall. So when we got talking about the games and when we go home and discuss it, my father then told us about his uncle, or our uncle, and said, you know that your Uncle Richard played? And my brother and I just went, no. How could he come down from Glasgow to here? He said he came down as a young boy because there wasn't much work, and evidently he walked down. Well, he did say that he was quite speedy and that he was a high goal scorer. My father actually followed down my uncle because he knew about the Orient, and that's why the reason why he came down to live in Leighton. All our family from the beginning of the 19th century have been associated with the Orient.
All over Leighton and Clapton, historical evidence of those players' lives is to be found. Supporter Stephen Jenkins does guided tours and has written a book about their story and campaigns tirelessly to make sure they are never forgotten.
How did you get to know about the 3 players?
Because it's in one of the Orient history books. Just a paragraph in the book saying the O's lost 3 players during the Battle of the Somme, William Jonas, Richard McFadden and George Scott. And I decided to look into that further myself. Ended up visiting their war graves, done it in a day, covering over 400 miles. Got back exhausted, but on the way back one of my friends said you should write a book about this, and that's what I did.
So specifically Richard McFadden, because I noticed the block of flats over there is the McFadden flats. He was a company style major, you got noted down here, but actually he'd been promoted to regimental sergeant major, but never got to actually pick up the promotion.
Yeah, very tragic. Yeah, he lost his life while leading a group of lads along the trenches. Was hit by a shell blast and taken to a field hospital in Couon, a little village on the Somme, and where he was hoping he was going to recover, but he died the following day.
But to be a regimental sergeant major, it takes a special kind of individual, clearly a real leader. He was a real local hero, wasn't he? And he was a bit of a character as well.
He was, yeah. He saved lives on 3 occasions before the war started. Yeah. Dragging a man from a burning building in Scotland before he came to the Orient, then rescuing a baby from a burning building in Clapton Park, just across the road from here, and then dragging a boy that was drowning from the River Lee. And he carried on in the same way in the Great War, going out to no man's land on numerous occasions, rescuing wounded comrades, and for that he was awarded the Military Medal. There were some real characters in the side, one of which was William Jonas, known as Billy to a lot of people. He was a real pin-up at the time with the female admirers, almost like the David Beckham of his time. You know, he was getting up to 50 letters a week from the ladies of the Orient. Whilst he was very, very happy to receive the accolades, he wanted to let everyone know that he was happily married. So he had to ask the Orient to put an article in the matchday programme saying, whilst I appreciate all the kind wishes and letters being sent to me by the ladies of Clapton and Hackney, could you please stop, because I'm happily married to my sweetheart Mary Jane. This is the home of William Jonas, the heartthrob of the ladies at Clapton Orient. Real character he was, wasn't he, eh?
And Richard McFadden moved in with him as well.
Yeah, that's right.
So it was a real boys' den.
They were boys then, they were boyhood pals, having gone to school together in the North East. Richard McFadden came to London first of all when he signed for the Orient, and in fact he managed to get William Jonas a trial at the club. Their partnership ended on the Western Front.
Yeah. And what amazes me is we're actually only one street away from where Spider Parker lived.
Well, that's right, yeah, and it's just indicative of the fact that the players live so local. And I'm sure it's just not Orient's case, but clubs from around the country at the time, both in football, rugby, and even cricket maybe, they all live more local than what sportsmen do these days.
So very much at the heart of a local community then?
Definitely, yeah, they would have shared the everyday life of the people in the area, would have gone to the shops, gone to the pubs, etc., I'm sure.
But when you have three people, their lives taken from such a small geographical area, that must have had a massive effect on the surrounding people in the local community.
It would have done, yeah. The loss of those three players was a major blow, not just for the football club, but certainly for the local area.
As the war finally came to an end and gallant men returned home, virtually every street in London would have had either a footballer or a rugby player living there at the time. So street after street, house after house, counted its losses. Football may have been slow to react at the start, but on reflection,
it became clear that many joined the footballers' battalion to save the honour of their game and fight in some of the bloodiest battles of the war. 4,500 men joined the battalion, of which nearly a quarter perished. And, as a postscript, soccer won the Royal Seal of Approval.
Prince of Wales came down to see Clapton Orient play Notts County with a show of respect for the Orient's war effort. So it shows you how Orient's example was looked upon in high places at the time.
As for rugby, it was widely accepted that without players from clubs like Rosslyn Park volunteering with gusto so early on, the result could have been very different. So it had a huge rise in popularity, but it lost thousands of its young players. So it had to deal with much more misery than joy.
Rugby borrows the language of warfare. You hear it all the time, talking about guys in the trenches, people with boots like howitzers. Rugby and warfare share a common language, but at the end of the day, you've got to remember that injury time in war lasts a whole lifetime, and the whole team doesn't get to go home for a beer after the game.
Hear more incredible stories about what happened in your area during the war with World War I at home at bbc.co.uk/WW1.